I became Catholic right around the time when Pope Benedict XVI was elected. And one of the most frustrating experiences for me as a new Catholic was the media's consistent portrayal of him in terms that weren't very accurate. Because the media has this unfortunate tendency to portray narratives in dualistic terms, as in protagonists and antagonists, victims and offenders, and liberals and conservatives. And the difficulty with the Catholic Church is that it doesn't fit into these dichotomies, and so they routinely find themselves shoehorning it into one of these two dimensions. For Benedict, they saw him as a conservative, so whatever they tried to report about him was usually an attempt to reinforce that interpretation. And Catholics like me, I think rightly, complained that this was an inaccurate portrayal of our Pope and the Church. Unsurprisingly, the same thing happened when Francis was elected, but on the other end of the spectrum. So he was cast as a liberal, and if you're a casual observer of the news and its headlines, you'd have no reason to think that he was anything but a champion on the left, because everything that they cover about him is something that resonates with that attitude. So when that started to happen, the same Catholics that labored to defend and correct the inaccuracies about Pope Benedict would jump at the opportunity to defend Pope Francis, and so they would produce the necessary context that would balance out that one-sided portrayal. But after a while, it seemed like those voices started to grow silent, while a new trend of subtle criticism and even sometimes open hostility towards Pope Francis started to emerge in certain corners of Catholic media. So where this became a relevant concern for me was in the surprising experience of finding myself disagreeing with the Pope. The more headlines I read and the more of that one-sided coverage I was exposed to, the more I couldn't help but be influenced by it. So take, for example, his recent comments that equated wasting food with stealing food right off the table of impoverished people. This one really hit me hard because on the one hand, we have a Pope who is so celebrated for being welcoming and non-judgmental, and then he says something that at face value appears to be so incredibly inflammatory and judgmental. The reason that comment stood out to me so much is because it implicated me and my family. My initial response was, well, that's easy for you to say. When was the last time you had to buy groceries or meal plan for a family of 7? And the reason we're such a big family is because we faithfully observe the teachings that your office upholds. To compare the accidental mismanagement of food resources that can occur from trying to keep a family of children fed to the malicious stealing from people that are already destitute seemed like it was unbelievably sophisticated and hurtful to those of us that are just trying to do our best. And you have to appreciate that as an enthusiastic convert to the Catholic Church, finding myself on the wrong side of the Pope's condemnations was a new and startling experience for me. And so it gave me incentive to spend some time reflecting on my relationship with Christ and the Church and the current pontiff who represents Christ. So in an attempt to gain some perspective, I've decided to go back and read his statements in their full and proper context, carefully and deliberately, as well as to spend some time listening to his critics to see if the complaints that they have about him are valid. One of the more common complaints about Pope Francis among his critics is that he lacks clarity when he speaks. The claim is that if he spoke with more definitive precision, then there would be less confusion and diversity of interpretation of the things that he says, which can lead to the spreading of misinformation. It seems like they want every statement of the Pope to be entirely without the possibility of differing interpretation. And as I thought about that, I realized that if we held Jesus to that same standard, we probably would have ended up on the wrong side of that story. See, we modern Catholics benefit from generations of theological clarification of all the things that Jesus said. So we're used to a lack of ambiguity, but the people that lived in Jesus' time and heard him preach did not have that same benefit. And Jesus spoke in ways that were ambiguous and open to interpretation quite often. Jesus' own disciples even questioned him about his use of parables as a teaching mechanism. And Jesus responded by quoting Isaiah, saying that the hearts of the people are calloused and that they do not see with their eyes and they do not hear with their ears. And I think that Jesus was pointing out that we have to encounter the mysteries of God with our hearts as well as our minds. I think that's why Jesus used poetic and metaphorical language often, and he even used hyperbole to exaggerate or emphasize his point. For For example, he said that among those born of women, there are none greater than John the Baptist. Taken literally, we'd have to assume that John the Baptist is greater than Jesus. He also said things like, unless you hate your mother and your father and even your own life, you're not fit to be my disciple. And there's another one for us Catholics that is always tough to interpret, which is that whole call no man father bit. If using exact language to avoid confusion is what we expect from our religious leaders, then I think we might have joined the wrong religion, because the guy who started it all didn't seem to agree with that notion. So in my experience of disagreeing with Pope Francis about the odd thing, I've decided to respond in a few ways. And the first is to not jump to conclusions whenever I see a headline framed by the secular media. Unless I'm willing to go and read the statement or the writing in its full and proper context, then I'm just going to have to ignore it or refuse to form an opinion about it. The second thing is to give him the benefit of the doubt. I think that too many people are jumping to the worst possible interpretation about the things that he says, and that just won't do. The last thing is that I'm learning to accept that there is room for disagreement and diversity under the umbrella of orthodoxy. At the end of the day, if I disagree with Pope Francis about a few things, I'm certain that I agree with him about the overwhelming majority of things. And that should be a good enough reason for me to consider myself on his side. Thank you guys for watching that. If you enjoyed that, then please like it and share it and subscribe and come follow along for more content. And if you want to support the making of these videos, then please consider supporting the business that makes them possible. Holdsworth Design is a digital marketing and communications company that specializes in web design, print design, branding, videography, and all that kind of stuff. So, and this is with a special emphasis on churches and ministries as well. So if you know somebody that needs those services, then please consider passing that along to them, and check out the website, which is www.holdsworthdesign.com.